So we've been waiting for a few minutes to let people trickle in. So I'm glad to see some people up at least this early for us in the US and maybe really late for people in other places of the world. But I guess I'll go ahead and start to keep everything on time. So I'm Laura Wilson, and I am a professor and curator at a small regional but state institution in Western Kansas. And so one of the things that's, very pertinent to my career, but also something I've thought more and more of going to SVPs, going to Romer Talks over the last couple of years, is a lot of us coming out of PhD programs or master's programs, postdocs, aren't going to be going into research one institutions. And sometimes that's by choice. That's not what we want to do. Sometimes that's the nature of the job market. So just really making sure that either we as students or us as people advising students are helping prepare those coming out of programs for research success, even if they don't have large institutional budgets. I wanted to start with a background of where I am and kind of what I've done. I think I am at, again, Fort Hays State University. We are in rural Western Kansas, a population of about 21,000. So not a huge town, though we do have the local Walmart. So we are the big town in the region. And then we are pretty unique because we have the Sternberg Museum of Natural History, which is I might be a little biased, a wonderful museum, not just for the size of the town, but in general. And we get a lot of positive feedback in terms of our exhibits. And then we also get a lot of traffic in terms of visiting our collections as well. I wanted to give just a brief kind of Fort Hays State at a glance to kind of show you where we are. We are a public university. We are one of our 6 Board of Regents universities, so we fall under the umbrella of the Kansas Board of Regents, which does provide a little bit of stability, but is also kind of an extra layer of politicking to go through within our programs. And our service area is really the western part of the state, and then bordering states of eastern Colorado, Nebraska, down into panhandle of Texas and Oklahoma. Our enrollment numbers have been shifting a lot lately, like pretty much all of our programs. And years ago, we were very early on the scene with online education going back into the early 90s, and with that in international partnerships, particularly with Chinese schools. So we have a huge online population, but we do have a very healthy on-campus student population in which we also offer master's degrees. So we're primarily an undergraduate institution. We fall under the undergraduate research institution for things like National Science Foundation, but many programs, including mine in the geosciences, does have a master's program. I threw in a couple of things about budget just because I got really interested in it and was not surprised, but still a little surprised to see what the percentage of our budget goes towards research. If you can see this diagram, it is this little tiny orange sliver, which comes out to $700,000, or 0.48% of our budget goes to research. Some of that is student-driven research, and a little bit of that is faculty-driven research. That being said, we actually do have really healthy faculty development funds available through our provost and sometimes our department. So we can have things like annual meetings covered at least once a year, which I know is unique compared to a lot of schools to not have to do that completely out of pocket. Something that threw me on this revenues is that is listed as 26% of our budget comes from grants and contracts. I looked into that. That's a lot of things like Pell Grants and things that are coming in for grants to students specifically, and tuition and things like that, and not necessarily overhead from big federal grant money. So research isn't a strong portion of our job description. And so we don't have to do things like write these big grants for 10 years and promotions like you see at an R1. So it very much balances in terms of resources and expectations. But again, things specific to me as paleontologists, also very beneficial to our biologists as well, is the Sternberg Museum of Natural History. We have a world-class collection. We are really focused, our mission is on the Great Plains of North America, and we've built a lot of resources to study the Great Plains environments, past, present, so that we can make predictions into the future. In terms of where I'm coming from in my job, I have a bit of a unique position at my institution, and even kind of compared to a lot of us within the field of paleontology. I have a professorship, so I'm part-time professor in the Department of Geosciences, and then I'm also a curator at the Sternberg Museum. Technically, I'm the chief curator, but usually I use the curator paleontology title. Because we're at a teaching institution, so if you're not familiar with breakdowns of contracts and statement of responsibilities, a lot of teaching institutions have what we call a 60-20-20, where 60% of your contract goes towards teaching. That's usually 12 credits or 3 to 4 classes a semester. 20% goes to service work and 20% goes to research. Those 20%, I think, come out to about 12 hours per week if you're looking at as a 40-hour-a-week breakdown, which is a joke to pretty much anybody in academia. Mine's different because my teaching and curation are split. So I only teach in load 6 credits, which is usually 2 classes. I teach a lot of lab classes, so I do those as kind of extra paid overloads, which is really nice for at least getting paid for the extra work you're doing. And one of the things that's really unique is I have 25% research time and 15% service. So I'm a little kind of higher on research time than other faculty. That being said, that's kind of like the biggest joke of my career, because in reality, those two things are switched. Never have I done, pretty much unless I'm at a conference, 10 hours of research within 1 week. It's usually between 2 to 5. My research specifically is looking at the Western Interior Seaway paleoecology. So I am sitting on my research area, means that I'm curator of a museum with the organisms that I need to study to answer the questions that I'm very much interested in. So a lot of advantages to being, to having my research program and research interests well in line with resources that I have immediate access to. And that's been really important for me as a researcher, but also as somebody who has undergraduate and graduate student researchers, for their projects and their interests, making sure that they're always specimens that I can at least guarantee access to. And I've really tried to take advantage of that as I've worked with students to craft research projects and research design. One of the tools that I use is paleohistology. So mostly with bones, I don't do a whole lot with teeth. And I really kind of want to highlight this because I do have a research agenda that has lab requirements, which means that there are equipment and upkeep and consumable requirements as well. So it's not things that I can do without some sort of budget if I want to continue pursuing histology for me and my students. I've diversified since being at Fort Hays as well, since I have a master's program. I help a lot of students move into undergraduate and master's level museum positions. So we do a lot of museum-based research projects, looking at assessment of exhibits and building education programs and things like that. So kind of outside the traditional specimens-based research. And then just one of the things that I've become passionate about in the last couple of years is trying to make a broader impact with my research. So where I'm kind of trying to move things into now is conservation paleobiology, because I work on ancient marine systems. I'm trying to work into kind of marine conservation. I'm working with sea turtles right now. So their sea turtles are very much a poster child for marine conservation. So I'm hoping that there'll be a lot of opportunities to cross over in research. So that's really who I am and where I'm coming from. And I really want to just spend a few minutes before I get into things that I have found helpful, kind of tips that I found helpful for working and building these programs where I don't have a startup. I don't have a lot of time for grant writing or even support at my institution for big research grant writing. And still the what I've been able to build around the museum and the department. So when I got here, I did not have a startup. My committee, my dissertation committee, when I got the job, very much advocated negotiate, negotiate, negotiate. My advisor, Dr. Karen Chin, was like, "Oh, I wish I had negotiated harder for more startup money." I got great advice, but I had no clue how to do that. So I feel like I'm very much like the typical female new employee, and really didn't fight that hard for anything. I was never offered a startup. It was never talked about. So I assumed there was not one available. The only question I really got about money and things like that was during my interview. The museum director was like, "Okay, what do you need for histology?" Kind of ballparking expense. I did luckily know that a lot of the equipment that I like to use is available secondhand on things like eBay, on places like eBay. And so I knew that I could get equipment at a fraction of the cost of, $10,000 for a brand new Bueller grinder or something like that. So I came into like half of an empty lab, or half of a lab. The other half was for stable isotope geochemistry prep. So pretty much just an empty lab bench, and no money to fill it. I'll talk a little bit how I've done it, but I've now been able to kind of build myself a histology for myself and my students, a histology research lab at the museum. When I got here, we had a tiny 240 square foot prep lab with no running water, no ventilation, no hood or anything like that. And so it was all hand tools. We didn't have compressed air. And since then, so by 2019, we'd opened a new prep lab that was 5 times larger. It has things like ventilation, it has running water. We've become much more integrated as kind of part of the exhibit gallery, so able to do a lot of education and outreach through this space. And this has been huge for not only the research side of things, but also the student professional development. I've had a lot of students go into prep labs as prep lab managers around the country. Another resource, because I am curator as well, but we all know that we need collections for research, was when I got to the Sternberg. So as recently as 2016, the most complete database we had was a card catalog system. I refused to use a typewriter pretty much and do everything in triplicate. So we had a ton of backlog, and that really comes from the fact that we have a part-time graduate student curatorial assistant and a part-time curator who never really gets 30% of that curation time to plug into the museum, because students and classes are expected to come first. So through kind of reprioritizing where I wanted to spend my curation time and some of my research time, we've been very successful to kind of bring things up into the current standards, best practices for museum curation, switching out all of our archival boxes, really focusing on data management and data archiving. We have a relational database now. And through this, we've also been able to get a lot of digitalization equipment, which has then been secondarily used from research. I've had a lot of students come in and do things like 3D geometric morphometrics, and been able to take advantage of us now having surface scanning equipment through some of these grants that we've gotten. So that's kind of what I've been able to build on a budget that very little of that has come in big chunks from the university. I didn't have a 200,000, I don't even know what startups are at an R1, but I did not have a big startup to get brand new equipment, fill in a lab, maybe fund students for a couple of years. I've gotten smaller chunks from the university in different ways. And that's really what I want to talk about kind of for the rest of this. So if you're looking at how to build these programs, you don't have a lot of time, you don't have a lot of money, some of the things to kind of consider as you go forward. And these are things that I kind of stumbled upon as I went. I've been in my position now for 11 and a half years. So it's taken me a little while to figure out. One of them is money comes from a variety of places. There are internal grants often available at institutions. I didn't have a startup, but we did have a kind of a program that different departments could put in kind of a request for either a project or a facilities upgrade or something like that. I was lucky that my department supported me my first year to put in a request to get histology equipment. And it was funded. It was kind of luck of the draw. The president of the university decided what he found interesting. And apparently, you know, I threw dinosaurs, even though I don't do work on dinosaurs, I threw the word dinosaur into my proposal enough to spark interest. So even though I didn't have a startup, I did get about $15,000 back in 2012, 2013, to get some used equipment, which I still use, I still love. I prefer it over the new stuff. Not quite research grade quality microscope, but still a decent, you know, couple $1,000 one with that point a 10 megapixel camera on it, and some consumables. One thing that I've taken advantage of strategically over the years is that because we are an undergraduate focused university, we have a lot of opportunities for undergraduate research grants. So I applied for my first one in 2015. It was really strategic. Like undergrad research was really the one thing I didn't have within my tenure file, and I was going up for tenure early, so like I wanted to do that to start a program with students and get some histology work done, to be added into my tenure file, and then also to see to use it to get equipment. I did not get the microscope that I wanted with that kind of first grant that I got from the university. So I actually used that undergraduate research grant, which go up to like $6,000 or $7,000. So it's a pretty healthy chunk of money, to get a different microscope that had a polarizer and had some of the lenses that I needed to really get into the histology research. I've also used these grants to fund travel for students to go to conferences, consumables. I have one that's improving SciComm skills, which I got last year. You know, I got like an iPad Pro, so kind of ways to kind of update your labs, pay for consumables, and get supplies as well. On that same note, using graduate students. So when I bring in students that specifically want to work with histology, kind of one of the things is I have consumables that I built and replenished over the years, but the idea, and this is something my PhD advisor did with me, is that the expectation is that they're writing grants for consumables and well. So it's just, you know, it can be a couple $100 to get glues and adhesives, to get molding and casting supplies, to get resins, with the idea that they're kind of helping replenish supplies that they use, and very much doable on the couple $100 to couple $1,000 grants that you can either get from our institution or from things like Geological Society of America. And then there's the external grants. These are the ones that we're a lot more familiar with within academia as a whole, and especially coming out of big research institutions where obviously we're going to be doing our graduate degrees, our PhDs. And it's been interesting to how to use these to further things across many different parts of my contract, I guess you could say, because I have not been supported by administration to write a big research grant. They haven't been supportive of me buying out a lot of my teaching time that I would have to be able to do like an NSF scale research, multi-year research project. So the NSF and IMLS grants have all been collection improvement grants, which have vastly helped the collections. It's allowed us to put our data online and to feed into big data aggregates like iDigBio. So again, in that way, very much facilitating research. We've been able to get student funding, which helps with retention and recruitment, and also, you know, our digitization equipment that we use again in our research. The big hurdle I came across was when I wanted to redo the prep lab, and this was one of kind of like my 5-year plan goals. And NSF and things like that typically don't fund infrastructure changes. So I actually went to the Dane G. Hansen Foundation, which is a local private foundation that funds a lot of education initiatives. And so I proposed them to help fund the prep lab. So one of the things with that was then the year that I applied for the Hansen Fund, they changed their metric and started doing matching grants. So I applied for $162,000 for the renovation, and they gave me $81,000 to then match. So this is where a lot of people might have to step outside their comfort zone or find partners at, there's a foundation fundraising opportunities within their institutions. Is I started hosting galas. I hosted 3 total to help raise money for the prep lab. This was the 3rd one that I did. It was a Margaritaville themed one. And then so together I could put the Hansen Foundation grant, money from the galas, working with our foundation to identify donors. We had a big private donor who brought in about 75% of what we needed to match. And together we raised actually over our match. So we raised $85,000 to match to the $81,000, and we're able to fully renovate our prep lab. One of the things, so this area that I have marked as histology on this kind of like schematic that we use in our fundraising, this was the original prep lab. So because we did a good job fundraising, and we were able to use actually the university building crews and save a lot of money versus having to contract it out to a local building crew. I was able to actually sneak a histology lab renovation in with this well, including kind of the big thing that I had been missing was a really high-end microscope. And so if you're familiar with histologies, these run, $25,000 to $35,000. So that was a big thing that I was able to work in, kind of move into my own space, close to collections, get things like a fume hood and running water, where now my students and I and other researchers from around campus can focus on histology. So through a lot of this, I've learned to be strategic about goals and projects, thinking about scale. If you have undergraduates, what they can do to meaningfully contribute to a project and maybe just a couple of year time period. I have a master's program. We try to get our students out in 2 years. That's all the funding we can typically offer. So scaling research projects accordingly, what can be done. And then also thinking ahead. So I took actually this picture yesterday of 2 of my graduate students. Harrison is a 2nd year, Carson is a 1st year. They both came in wanting to do histology. And so they're actually now set up with histology projects on 2 different species of Tylosaurus, which one species is enough for each of a master's level project. And then at the end of it, they can pull it together to answer bigger questions about, especially like the debate over taxonomy within some of these Tylosaurus species. So overall, I really took advantage of getting tenure back in 2017 and kind of reprioritizing my research program to focus specifically on Western Interior Seaway with the goal of scaffolding projects to answer bigger questions. So through my time, I've been able to work on things like the birds of the Western Interior Seaway. I'm working on pterosaurs right now, Pteranodon, and I've worked on sea turtles, but that's just a fraction that I've been able to cover myself. And over the past 10 years, I've had students add mosasaurs in a variety of research, add plesiosaurs. I've had a couple of students look at fish dynamics and evolution and trophic ecology, and I even had a student work on ammonites, one of my early students. So together, kind of being strategic about how we scaffold our projects and taking lots of little projects, and if they're designed well, you can add them into a bigger, larger scale questions and larger scale projects. My tip 3, we're almost there, is really just kind of the obvious one in terms of fostering collaborations and maintaining these connections, building the reputation and name of your institution, sending your alumni out to spread the good word about things that are happening at your institution can be really beneficial. Cretaceous World for us is a great example of this. This is an NSF funded thematic collections network that had the goal of digitizing fossils to reconstruct the evolving ecosystems of the Western Interior Seaway. So while it was a data improvement collection management grant, it made sure that the data that I study specifically is online and available. So this has been really impactful to me and my students' research. There were 9 institutions around the country that had significant Western Interior research or seaway collections that all contributed data to it. And I was also able to fund a bunch of students on this project, getting them experience. You don't always have to look externally for collaborations. So David Levering, who's put together this wonderful conference, is in charge of our summer camp program. He's our camps director, and he's been a great collaborator. He runs high school and middle school field camps. So students that are paying for educational experiences to come out to the Sternberg and the Chalks during the summer to learn, to play, to have fun. They're bringing in revenue through that camps program. And then David's been very generous of partnering with me in terms of, okay, if I go out with students into the field, we kind of partner on field expenses for plasters, for generators, burlap, things like that. He also has organized fossil preparation camps. So we replenish a lot of our consolidants in the prep lab, as well as update our kind of smaller equipment through revenue through those summer camps. He's also been great about hiring my students or Fort Hays students to fill TA and instructor positions so they can get those experiences. And then obviously, the real reason why we go to SVP is to build and then also maintain connections. So this first picture, this is actually from 2018, was current and alumni Fort Hays students all getting together. So a growing presence of that way of future and current collaborators. This is an example from this SVP. I did my master's at Montana State University in Museum of the Rockies. This was a portion of the Montana State crew that was at SVP this week. A lot of these programs, we send students to each other, to our undergrad and graduate programs. We send students to do field work with each other, and then we also do research projects together. So a way of collaborating and maintaining collection. The last 2 are things that I highly advocate for, but am horrible at. So this is a do what I say, not do what I do. The first one is protecting your time. I'm horrible at this. This can come with prioritizing projects. Sometimes having 1 to 5 year plans can help. Sometimes you might have to sacrifice short-term progress to allocate time to write grants. That's pretty much what I did in 2015. I knew that we weren't going to make any significant headway in collection care if we didn't bring in a big pot of money, and then we're able to hire students to help with projects. So I pretty much shut down a lot of collections projects and research projects with the goal of just writing grants. And it paid off. 2016, I brought in a little over $300,000 between 2 grants. And that really put us in a good place for moving forward there. Some of the smaller tips and tricks are things like scheduling time for research. So actually like putting time on your calendar. Here's 2 hours where I'm going to spend time doing research, and making sure that people don't try to schedule meetings over that. One of the things I've done this semester, we've started writing accountability groups where it's just 2 hours is all my calendar is scheduled. I go into a room with colleagues. We spend 5 minutes at the beginning and say, these are my goals for the next 2 hours. We write for 2 hours, and then we report out and talk about what our goals are for the week until we meet again. And it's been a great way, is what I do with my graduate students in our lab meetings. What are you doing? What are your goals? And then report back. And so things of getting time on my calendar where I don't feel guilty. And it's ridiculous that I feel guilty about doing research, but I do, even though it should be 25% of my contract. And then the last one is just where I've kind of found myself. I feel like I'm finally pulling out of it, but between 2016, 2017, I had a child, And I really changed my research priorities there to be home more, to get out of the lab. I didn't want to be messing with chemicals when I was pregnant. Then I had complications and bed rest and all that fun stuff. And then kind of coming out of that, and I finished that project, my baby project, right before the pandemic. And so I definitely went through a period where I felt isolated, felt like I'm being left behind. You go to SVP and people are doing all these crazy research, and I just don't have enough time to make enough headway on research projects to present new research every year at SVP. So understanding that you can work on different timescales depending on your institution and your contract. You can't always bring the same amount of money or equipment to the table, but this is where the other tips come in of building and maintaining relationship, harnessing the power of students, contributing where you can, find balancing in your goal. And then also, I think we can do a lot more to build partnerships at similar institutions. I've talked about things kind of in the histology world, especially with histologists outside of Research One institutions, of maybe there are ways that we can build a database of what slides, what animals, what bones of what animals have already been cut. So we know what's out there, and we can start using resources that are already been made, because for histology, one of the big resources for us is time. If we aren't running big labs and we don't have someone full-time or even part-time dedicated to helping with the lab work, that's on us. And that's a very time-intensive project. So I think is just, remembering that we have colleagues within the field and reaching out for them to make sure that we're kind of contributing to common goals. So that's all I've got to share. Thank you very much. I think at this point, we're opening for questions and discussions. I'd love to hear kind of what you're doing at your institutions, or if you have anything else to add to this list. I am going to stop sharing at this point so we can all see each other. Sorry, Russell, go ahead.
Okay. So you talked a lot about your experience with can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
With Fort Hays State University, and again,
Mhm.
you pointed out very early on that one of the big advantages to working at Fort Hays is you're basically sitting on top of your fossil deposits.
Yes.
There are a lot of relatively analogous small East Coast universities that aren't situated on top of large fossil deposits. Do you have any advice for what to do in those situations? Because in that case, I would assume that like either traveling to large museums or traveling to the field is going to be a very big time and cost sink.
Right. And I think that's a lot where the networking and partnerships come into play. Whether it's talking to institutions that might be too far to travel regularly, but might have collections that are interest, kind of getting whether you can get in as a if you want the title, some sort of associate or adjunct curator. I know a lot of people do that, that are working at institutions that don't have attached museums, giving them a little bit more access to collections, reliability and familiarity for taking out loans. At Fort Hays, we have several adjunct and associate curators who add specimens in, but also are regular loaners of specimens out. Thinking about this is where kind of strategic project design comes in, especially in the world of data digitization and data sharing push. There are a lot more resources for getting specimen data, for getting digital data, for getting 3D data, MorphoBank, MorphoSource, plus things like the PaleoBio database and the iDigBio. And so that's kind of what I tell my students is like, you're not required to work on specimens in the Sternberg Museum. They are required to do something Western Interior Seaway. I've really kind of focused things that way. You don't have to work on things, collections. Do understand if you do, I can guarantee access for them. But then it really comes down to project design at that point. And if you require money to travel to see a collection, where's that money going to come from? And then what happens to the project if that grant doesn't get funded? If you want to take out loans from other institutions, that's usually possible, but you have to add on the time that it takes to facilitate that loan. And so I've had a lot of students kind of do metadata analyses, where they're pulling data from these databases and analyzing them in different ways. So there can be that it might not be that you're doing field work every summer, and you might not be going into a different collection multiple times a year, but you can still kind of be very strategic about how you align yourself with other institutions, as well as project design, to still getting cool data sets and doing things with them that might not necessarily require having specimens in place, especially since a lot more of us have things like 3D scanners. We scan specimens all the time for people who can't get to the collections. We know we're remote. We know that we're rural, and we know that people don't always have the time and money to get to us. So we're always more than happy to surface scan stuff and send files if that's what a researcher needs to do their project. Mel.
Sorry, I clicked the wrong button. I just first, great talk. Thanks, Laura. I work for a state institution, a museum, and so my allocation of time is really different from my colleagues. I have time but no resources, and so I'm wondering if you have any recommendations for, how to manage these collaborations with different types of colleagues who have really different allocations, right? The 26 to 60, 25%, because that's been a little bit challenging for me, because a lot of my colleagues, like, I got my degree and I did my postdocs at these R1s. And so those are the collaborators that I've acquired so far. And, we've got just very different needs and very different sort of ways that we work.
Right. So I think that's where we could probably, as a field, do a better job with communicating. And this is something that's really been brought to my attention. I think how unique maybe we are in the sciences, or maybe other disciplines are still really weird. But I've been working with a sociologist and a librarian on a paper that has nothing to do with paleo, and all to do with actually focus groups that we ran doing service work for the institution. And so we kind of developed a new method and implemented during these focus groups, and now we're writing it up. And it's been really interesting working with them in terms of how much conversation there is on division of labor, and who's going to do what part, and here's, like, read these papers, report back, you're going to write this section up, you're going to write that section up. And, like, I'm third author on this paper, and it is more work than I have ever put into a third author, like, combined on all junior author papers I've been on. And so it's been really interesting just to see how much different those collaborations are than often I've experienced within paleo, where it's like you have your first author, or maybe your second author, or your first author and their advisor doing all of the work, and then other people are put on because of specimen access or providing data, maybe writing one section. So I think there's a lot that we can do to communicate and laying out expectations. You kind of get a group coming together with a project, and it's from the bat, like, I have these resources, I can contribute this. I have more time, maybe I'll do more data analysis or take a bigger brunt of the writing. And I think we could do a much better job communicating those expectations even before we get to a project. I got an email last night actually from a graduate student colleague who's starting a project, and she emailed, all of the people that have kind of been tagged as co-authors on that. And it was like, hey, let's get down on Zoom and really nail who's going to contribute what the timelines are going to be. And that's really the first time within paleo that I've been part of a collaboration that takes that approach from day one. We're a group, we're going to work together, let's talk about who can do what, and in what sort of time frame. And so for me, that would be my advice, and is something that I'm just starting to experience on the research side. See, we have a question from Rebecca in the chat. How do you recommend building collaborations with other researchers to help continue research success, especially when you are in a small program with lower financial resources? And so, hi, fellow Western Interior Seaway researcher. And, I think that's really where, one of the things that I really want to do, and this is a little bit of an aside, is I feel like Western Interior Seaway research specifically isn't something that people have necessarily, like, focused their career on. There are a bunch of us who have, but a lot of people will come in, they'll describe something, they're looking at the taxonomy and not necessarily looking at kind of like world or ecosystem building. So like I'd love just to put together things like working groups and whether it's at GSA or SVP, some sort of symposium. And I think these are great ways to figure out who's interested in doing what in the field, and even just starting those collaborations rather than, kind of siloed until you happen to like bump into someone or have a conversation, like at a conference or something like that, or, even Google Scholar stalking somebody like, okay, who does this? Let's look at their research and then reach out to them. And we all know that kind of sending out blind emails, even if we're colleagues and not even kind of in a power differential, can be pretty intimidating. So I think we can definitely do a better job of building networks, and things like this where we have these panels or these topical kind of ways or areas to get together, or times to get together to talk about topical things, I think is a great way. But Rebecca, your comment really nails some of the problems that I've had with siloing. I mean, I'm very much siloed within my institution, which is very common, I think, at small institutions. Like we have to cover all of geology with 4 faculty. So like we don't have a whole lot of overlap, which doesn't lead to a whole lot of natural internal collaborations. And then kind of going back to Mel's question and some of the other ones, knowing that we have different resources, including time, it can be hard to figure out where we fit into larger scale projects or big research one time and money. And so I think that it really comes down to us that we need to be doing a better job of networking during and outside of meetings. But I don't have a great answer for this, because I think we have a lot of room to improve. And, it's kind of just knowing the right people to get invited. Like, ooh, like I went to the marine reptile launch this year at SVP, and it was super fun, and I've never been before. So knowing that was a thing, but it also, like, I've been working on marine reptiles for 15 years before I knew that, I saw a lot of these other researchers that ended up there. And that, I think, does exclude a lot of students and a lot of junior colleagues from building the networks they need to kind of sustain things going forward. So I would love any ideas that you have. Yes, please send me a follow-up. I'd love to chat more about this. It's kind of in line with what I talked about with a histology researcher colleague who is at a very small rural institution. They don't have a graduate program. They have next to no money and next to no time for research. And that was the conversation that I had about, like maybe we should build a histology database of who's done what, who's cut what, where it's housed, what bones were cut, what the slides are like. So we even know what's already been done and can cut down on some of that lab work, which takes the bulk of our time and also the resources. So we shouldn't have to always invent or reinvent the wheel every time we step into a new position or try to start a different program at a different institution. Okay, so comment from Lindsay. Oh, your load is 80, 10, 10. What is that, a 5-5? Are you teaching? That's intense.
we have a lot of lab classes, so it balances out a little bit, but we're on the quarter system.
Okay.
Which is nuttier.
Yeah, like I'm overwhelmed with my 2-2, and I teach a lot more credits than 6, but I've now learned that I can demand to be paid for them. That was not something that my first department chair let me know, that we should be paid or could be paid for teaching more than our contracted credits. So I do teach more than that now, but I am damn sure that I'm paid for those credits.
Yeah, that's a constant
and it's
fight.
A choice,
That's a constant fight we deal with as well. With the budgets and everything right now.
And being at these institutions, I don't want to villainize these institutions. They're very important, like those undergraduate research. I love working with students. I love being in the classroom. I do have the advantages of being at a museum, and I fully realize that. But we might have these really high teaching expectations, but what comes with that is low research expectations. And so we're not required to write these grants. We're not required to pull in funding for our students. We're not, like, our tenure isn't hinging on grants success or even grant writing. When I was, my first department chair that hired me was like, yeah, there's like one non-dissertation publication requirement for tenure in 6 years. And even that's negotiable. Like, if you're really good in the classroom, you can let that research slip, because that's not what the focus is. And so it's just, I think, a lot harder on us who, you know, find ourselves in a position or really enjoy our positions at these smaller, lower budget, and I don't want to say lower budget, that's not the right term, but not resource or not research focused institutions that that still have the desire to do very high level and impactful research. And I think that's where, like, sometimes our goals, I feel like sometimes my research goals very much don't align with the institution that I am, where I am, although I came here out of my research or out of my dissertation program very strategically. I did not at that time want to go to an R1 institution. I saw 3 female faculty go through the tenure program. 2 of them had families at that time. And I'm like, wow, this just looks like a lifestyle that I don't want. So things like getting through tenure was pretty low stress for me. And like at Fort Hays, I think we have like a 93% or higher success rate for tenure. So your priorities definitely switch. But luckily with that, I found that the expectations of the university switch. So like, it's not all struggle and doom and gloom, but you know, there are a lot of advantages of being a big fish in a small pond, or you know, still having those struggles with what you want to do for research with what the resource is. And for me, it's time. Like, time is my biggest resource struggle. It's not even a money thing at this point. It's time.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you again for it. It's refreshing, and it makes me feel better that I'm not the only one out here at struggling with the same things, because we're the same. I'm trying to digitize our collection. It's we have more of a largely invert, but we still have some vert stuff, but it's all on cards. Half of it's typed, half of it's handwritten.
Yeah.
With very little information. And so it's nice to know that, and very little resources. So it gives me hope.
Yeah.
It bolsters
it's a struggle,
enthusiasm.
and I don't know what your situation. You're in Canada, right?
No, I'm in Washington State.
Oh, okay.
Now,
so you do have access to at least like US federal stuff. And that's kind of the nice thing with like the NSF or IMLS grants is, you know, they're geared towards what you need to build the collection, and you kind of get away from that research focus that we often don't have time to do. So Mel, I'm reading the comment that you dropped while Lindsay and I were talking. Taking the time to sort out what everyone can bring to the table is important and a critical part. Yeah, so I agree. Like, I do think we have the temptation to jump straight in. And I know I get excited about a project and I go, and then like all of a sudden I'm overwhelmed and 2 years in and like, oh, you know, I don't have the data set that I want. And so sometimes it's feeling like we're compromising in the data set that we amassed before we call a project finished or finished for now. And so I think starting those collaborations from the beginning, and, you know, my last 2 papers, my last 2 big papers were both single authored, and I hated it. You know, one of it was my baby project that I put my histology on hold. So something that I could like literally be working on while my kids doing tummy time, like next to me, and I could just do it all based on data that were accessible, and nothing that was lab based. So that was kind of like one of them. And then the next one, when I finished that one, I was department chair and I had 0 time for research. And so when I stopped being department chair, I had a sabbatical, but it was like fall of 2020. So really nice to not be in the classroom, but also kind of bad timing to be starting a sabbatical. So it was just like definitely pandemic silo of I'm literally just sitting in my lab by myself, which was nice. I didn't have to wear a mask. But having to kind of work alone for 2 projects kind of really got me down, and was something that I don't want to do anymore. I think you can do strong research independently, but it's much more fun and much more comfortable for me to be working in groups and being able to exchange ideas. Russell, your hand's raised.
Yeah. So I wanted to say, like, to build on what you were saying about the Roma presentations, when I've gone to SVP, basically every year, but especially the last 2 years, and just for clarification, I'm speaking as a late stage graduate student going on to early career researcher probably in the next couple years. I felt that exact fear. I come from a lab where we don't do this high tech, any of this high tech stuff, and it makes me terrified about being able to function and compete um, in the research arena.
Yeah.
So I think that your fears are very agreed upon by at least some graduate students.
I'm not glad to hear that those fears are shared, but I am thrilled that people are thinking about that. And I'm hoping that through things like this and other conversations, we're also getting to the advisors of students like you and your colleagues, of like, that's great. Use the resources we have. Don't not use resources because you might not have them later, but how can that translate? How can you start building these networks as a graduate student? How can you start planning out, you know, the next 10 years of your research career? Because that's a lot of times what happens after a dissertation. You kind of, I don't want to say surf, but you build all of these, every, you know, how science works. Every time we answer one question, we have 12 more. And so I know that I kind of continue the trajectory of my dissertation research for the next 10 years of my career. And so like having these conversations of, if you don't have these resources, what can you do? If you don't have a huge startup budget, how can you get what you need? And I felt that was the one thing I wasn't prepared for in my interview, was that one question of like, how much is it going to cost to start a program here? I knew what equipment I needed, but I had never thought to look at what the prices of those were. So I could actually come up with like, oh, I'm going to need $15,000 minimum. And maybe it's good I didn't have that, because I don't know if that would have made me less attractive for the position that I got or not, versus me being like, oh, it's no problem. I know I can get that on eBay. It'll be cheap. But yeah, I'm glad that you're thinking about these things and starting these conversations. Kinshu?
Yeah, I'm the one who actually capitalized the fact that I can carry out my research with a low budget. And that's actually worked in my favor. Initially, I was hired as a 2-year contract visiting assistant professor, and I was frankly applying for jobs third year, and then like 2 weeks before my first interview was scheduled from another school, the dean changed his mind, and then I'll keep, I can offer you a tenure track position, but it's either take or leave it, because there was no startup fund offered. The department scraped off some money from different sources, and I was able to have like a few $1,000s to buy the specimen cabinets, but I was happy. And I think, you can actually use that, the lack of fund, but still can carry out research. I think I'm one of the most productive faculty in my college, with probably one of the lowest budget that I get. So, yeah. Just my 2 cents.
And Kinshu's another great story of things that relate to some of these earlier questions that we have. So, Kinshu does a lot of Western Interior research, and all the sharks, but isn't necessarily sitting on those deposits. But he's a Fort Hays alum, and he's kept up that research. Kinshu, I should know, are you research associate, or do you have a curator title at the museum?
On paper, it says associate curator, I think, or adjunct curator, but I call myself as a research associate. So
yeah, so he's kept up those connections. So like he's kept up that pipeline, which we advance. Like he collects a lot of specimens, and then we reposit them, which is great for the growth of our collection as well as the use of the collection. And then kind of gives him easy access of a place to make sure everything he collects and wants to study is reposited. And so like he's been great of being able to keep up those connections to facilitate the research, even though he might not have a home museum or like literally sitting on top of the deposits that he's studying. They just might be buried a bit more than they are here. Yeah, Lindsay made a great point in the comment of having the discussion. So for us as mentors and advisors, or even just friends of people with these questions, having discussions about the cost of things and budgeting. That's something that, like, I had a great relationship. I still have a great relationship with my PhD advisor. But we never really had a lot of those budget conversations. We had a lot of like what job applications and what tenure applications look like. But I think that was something, again, that that was probably least prepared for. And really all of my budgeting experiences come from either managing and writing and managing grants or like being department chair. And I'm like, oh, this is what an institutional budget looks like. That's fascinating.
Yes. Thank you for your presentation. I've gotten some ideas out of it that I can use. I teach, I teach, it's not correct. I retired from 29 years of public school teaching. Many decades ago, I was at the University of Kansas as a graduate student, and some of the techniques I learned there, I'm using again now that I'm retired from teaching. Working on late Cretaceous material here in South Carolina. And I formed a relationship 25 years ago with a small local museum so that I have desk space. I have a place to do acetic acid preparation. They buy me the materials that I need at different times. And in return, I'm a voice to the public. I go out and do presentations for the public. I usually do a couple of them here at the museum itself. And then other times I go to other museums because they hear about me and invite me to come down and do talks at there. So doing the talks seems to be the return for having a title of museum associate in paleontology, but it's a completely volunteer position. But they give me equipment, they give me the microscope. I don't have a nice fancy microscope, but I've got a stereo microscope and I can do the basic stuff that I need to do. So thank you for your talk, and you've given me some more ideas. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think that's wonderful that you've found a place that works for you, and works for them. Like, I mean, things are always going to work better if it's, you know, a mutually beneficial arrangement. But I think you're a great example, well, sometimes how snobby we can definitely be in academia. And I think we've gotten this way a lot more in recent years with kind of judging people by their degree or lack of degree. And I think there's a lot of work that we can do with people who might come into paleontology in different ways. Avocational paleontologists that have a huge amount of their own time and resources, things that we don't always have as academics to bring to the table. Another great example, you know, we have at the Sternberg, Mike Everhart, who's an adjunct curator for the museum, and you know, is one of the like most prolific mosasaur like researchers and publishers, and came into paleo very non-traditionally, growing up in Kansas and fossil hunting, but after going through like a career with Boeing, but he's added so much to the museum, and hopefully we've been able to give some back to him for having kind of a research home that he can use to further his research goals. So I think we can definitely do a lot more to get people from all backgrounds helping for a common goal. And I think this kind of goes some degree to what Mel's comment was of, we kind of jump straight in, but we also like, okay, if I'm going to be lead author, like I have to do it all. And I think we also need to step away from that and be a little bit more collaborative with all resources, including people and their time and their knowledge.
Laura, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your experiences with the kind of working with members of the community who are not academics or even really associated with university, landowners, folks you're fundraising with, and strategies for starting off on the right foot, because often these folks are not coming from anywhere near academia, and you have to kind of interact with those folks in a way that you might not meeting a new colleague or something like that.
Right. No, I mean, I think that's a great thing, especially for those of us who do field work and look for resources outside of applying for a BLM permit. Like Kansas is 99% privately owned. We don't have big tracts of federal land. We have a few tracts of state land, and everything is private pretty much. So it's all liaising with locals to get access. And it's difficult because there are not a whole lot of other museum and university institutions out here digging, but we do have a lot of commercial and private collectors digging out here, completely legal, not passing judgment, but it is a different ball game because they can pay for land access and we can't. So for me, the biggest thing that I can throw to the table is education and working with students. And that's something that no matter the walk of life, a socioeconomic background, or a political alignment, that everybody I've met gets behind, is providing opportunities for students. So like I don't go into unless I'm just like checking out a site for the first time and it's a weird time, like I pretty much always have students that go out with me. If I'm helping David find access to sites for his campers, then, you know, like having that camper, that student aspect is something that's really been beneficial. And then the other part is just practicing how to talk to people, I think, is a big part of it. So you don't want to seem like you're dumbing down because they don't have the academic background. Like, they're very smart people, they're just smart in different subjects than we are typically. But also, you know, you don't want to elevate, like use all your technical jargon and come off as kind of elitist or snobby that way. So there's kind of this balance. Working with museums is great because, you know, we kind of like give our pitch to the general public and work on how to explain things and describe things. And so that's kind of the way that I've done it, is just kind of finding the right tone to strike in conversation, so they're part of the conversation and they're not left out kind of on the either feel like they're being talked down to or they're being talked above. Really emphasizing the education and the student experience. And then, you know, kind of the one financial thing we can throw are like you know, tax donations. So if somebody donates specimens from their property, they can claim it on income tax and things like that. And that's really the only financial bone we can throw that way, no pun intended. But other than that, you know, there are other ways that we've been successful. A couple of years after I got here, I was actually contacted by a couple of high school students, a couple of counties over, that were asking like, hey, we have like our science teacher knows where a mosasaur is, and we're going to do this for our big like honors biology project. How do you dig up a fossil? And I'm like, oh boy, that's a very complicated question to talk about over a phone call. And there's a lot of equipment. So at that point I go in and like I can't really justify using my time and museum resources for a fossil that's not going to come into the museum. So starting that conversation of like, we would love to teach you and show you how and work with you with this to make sure that it's done correctly. We just need to see if the landowners are willing to donate it. And so we worked with a high school teacher who knew the son of the landowner and was able to get us access. And we went out there a couple of weekends over the spring and had the high school students digging it up. We probably should have done a lot more PR around this, but I was still pretty new at that time. Brought the fossil back to our non-existent prep lab. We actually had to it was too big to fit in our little 240 square foot prep lab. So we had to like partition off another part of the museum where we were like prepping over carpet and had no water and were like bringing buckets of sediment out. And that was before we had microscopes set up. So we weren't doing anything under microscope, but we had the high schoolers for 2 more years, like different generations of high schoolers running through this teacher's class, come out to prep this mosasaur. And so that's kind of one of my flagship collaborations with local resources that I think has been great. Like, they got 4-H projects out of it. They got science fair projects out of it. They got, you know, cool things to talk about, you know, going into job interviews or on college applications. And, you know, the specimen ended up at the museum and got fully prepped by probably in a quicker time scale than we could have done with our limited resources at the time. So kind of sometimes things fall into your lap and sometimes you have to pursue them. And so it's just taking advantage of both those things. Thank you for the wonderful questions and the comments that you all added, and for being here, especially on a Saturday morning.
Laura, do you want to throw your Twitter so people have, or your email or whatever you're comfortable with, into the chat? And that way people want to follow up, they have a direct way to do that.
So I just threw my email into the chat, and my handle, which is Twitter and Insta and any other social media that might be out there. But yeah, feel free to contact. Like I said, I'll also be kind of popping in and out of the GatherTown Museum, the virtual museum, for a while. See y'all later. Thank you.